Hello, and welcome to this Carnegie Endowment for International Peace virtual event on climate science, policy, fiction, and narrative, which we will be using to frame the upcoming special report on cities and climate change. My name is Marissa Jordan, and I am the program manager of Carnegie, California, the Carnegie Endowment's fairly new West Coast initiative. The Carnegie Endowment is a DC-based think tank and the oldest think tank in the US, and it focuses on a range of today's most pressing issues. Carnegie, California similarly focuses on a range of topics, including technology, trans-Pacific relations, and subnational affairs. And then within a couple of those buckets, climate and migration. Today's co-host, the Carnegie Endowment Sustainability, Climate, and Geopolitics program, is also a fairly new, more reinvented initiative of the Carnegie Endowment. The program, located in DC, is co-directed by Dan Baer and Noah Gordon. Noah will be joining us on stage later in the event. And with that, I am pleased to turn the program over to Carnegie, California's founding director, Ian Klaus.
Thanks, Marissa. And our speakers are spread out across the world. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, I guess, in Europe and in India. We gather in support of and to inform the upcoming scoping meeting for the upcoming special report on cities and climate change that will be part of AR7. And we have a couple speakers who will be part of that meeting and who can let us know a bit about how we got there. But quickly, a word on what is a little bit of an unconventional 1 hour for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And perhaps an unconventional frame for others. We're bringing together fiction writers, experimental fiction writers, established policymakers at the elite sort of world-class level, and great scholars from Carnegie and elsewhere to think about what narrative means, both for science, but also how fiction can inform that and vice versa, bi-directional flow. So a couple of framing words. We are an organization focused on international peace. But we think that words do work. And here we'll go to one of the original poems on war and peace, the Iliad, in Robin Lane Fox's most recent book, which points out that the vast majority of that poem is actually about people compelling action through words rather than through violence. And we gather here in part because we think the words of science and the words of fiction do work. We also think, as such, texts do work. They matter in the world. Matthew Schneider-Meyer is a scholar on this. It has a good piece called The Influence of Climate Fiction, in which he did data-driven work on what climate science fiction does in the world and found that, quote, most readers attested to the value of cli-fi as a tool for enabling the imagination of potential climate futures. So if words do work and texts do work, a final point I would say is that narratives do work. They are familiar because they allow us to feel at home within stories we might not necessarily recognize. But they also do work in that they build coalition. They can tell stories. They can bring people under a tent or an umbrella where we can have political coalitions that advance difficult challenges, to include climate change, migration, and climate-driven migration. So today you're going to hear from two IPCC authors who are also participating in the scoping meeting. You're going to hear from a range of Carnegie experts on migration, narrative, and climate change. And you're going to hear from two great experimental fiction writers who are joining us from Paris, who are members of the Alipo. So I think we're just going to jump right into it. And we're even still on schedule 3 minutes in, which is remarkable. First, Seth, I'd like to start with you. You helped found and launch one of the most influential city networks in the world, the C40 Cities Group. You now lead Resilience Rising, a fascinating collection, speaking of coalitions, of private sector, non-profit, and non-governmental actors around the world to advance resilience. And of course, you were a lead author on SR 1.5, the special report on 1.5, which was sort of among, or perhaps was, the most influential report that came out of the AR6 cycle. So thinking of coalitions and narratives, can you just give us a little bit of background on how cities came to be not an additional or an extra or an outside actor in climate diplomacy and climate science, but have really worked their way into sort of the central part of the conversation? Couldn't be exhibited anywhere more clearly than in the fact that the one SR special report coming out of AR7 is focused on cities. So how did we get here, Sal?
Yeah, first, Ian, thanks to you and Carnegie for having us. It's a very, very fun conversation. I do a lot of these, but I haven't looked forward to one as much as this. And I think the confluence of the group of people you've brought together is fascinating. So big thank you for that, first off. But it has been a fascinating journey that you just mentioned on how we got here. I mean, I don't know if a lot of people understand this yet because it's pretty new, but the special report on cities, as you just mentioned, will be the only special report for the entirety of the AR7 cycle. It's a huge deal, particularly because of how the IPCC works. And I think we'll hear from Ara a little bit more about that. But to your point on how we got here, I mean, first and foremost, a lot of hard work. And from a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different communities. But one of the kind of key things in that journey of understanding the importance of cities is actually how a society works. I mean, the majority of human beings and economies are based in cities. And I think as more and more of that got understood, it also became more and more clear that cities are a large contributor and driver of the current issues that we have with regard to climate change. They're producing the majority of those emissions. But the fascinating thing around this is that the way cities work, which is hyper-local, don't show up in intergovernmental processes. They don't have a seat at the table. All the UN systems and agencies are built for what we call nation states, and cities don't figure into that. Also, another big gap is cities don't figure into traditional academic processes, right? So it's not the cryosphere, it's not Earth systems. What is cities? It's kind of up until now, up until recently, been kind of the space of like planners, maybe architects and policy folks at a local level. So you had this kind of massive gap on our understanding maybe like 20, 30 years ago on how huge and important cities were, but actually there was no place for them to show up and engage in this. So over the last 20, 30 years, there's been a bunch of hard work and the proliferation now of what we refer to broadly as city networks. So organizations working to kind of collaborate and coordinate cities on various topics. I happen to have been very heavily involved in kind of connecting cities vis-a-vis the topic of climate change. And there's lots of them, right? There's ones like UCLG that work more with the intergovernmental agencies and the processes. There's organizations, one of the earliest around is ICLEI. ICLEI works with cities all over the world. Then there's kind of organizations like C40 that we helped establish that's working with the mega city mayors. And then there's been kind of even further inundations. Now there's a Resilient Cities Network that focuses just on resilience. There's the Global Covenant of Mayors that networks between all of them. And this has just kind of exploded onto the scene, much needed, by the way, because of this lack of coordination. And also because of the variety of issues that cities are dealing with, both in terms of the government that they're in, the geographical place that they're in, and the size that they're in. So lots of ability to kind of coordinate and work around this. But again, the real big issue is that up until now, cities have largely been left on their own figuring this stuff out. So there was nobody providing science to them, providing evidence to them. So it actually became kind of a cottage industry on data. So explosion more recently, last 10 or 15 years, around the digitalization and the electrification of infrastructure and data has been a huge step forward in cities. And they've been kind of generating their own data and their own processes, with now a burgeoning awareness from the academic community that their science is needed on that level and scale. And some of that work led to a very large convening that happened around 2017, 2018 in Edmonton. And it was one of the first times in the middle of the AR6 cycle after the 1.5 degree report that you mentioned, where the issue of the importance of cities came to the forefront. And during that, as the IPCC, kind of the world's most really rigorous and prestigious kind of collaborative body of synthesis science in the world on any topic, they realized that cities were more and more important, but also there was this gap in the peer-reviewed literature. So everybody gathered together at Edmonton. We brought together a bunch of this policy city wonks, a bunch of the city networks and NGOs, philanthropy, development banks, and scientists. We had about 800 people convene in Edmonton on the very topic of cities and science. And I think that was a big turning point in turning the kind of academic world into the greater awareness that there's a massive effort and need for science and evidence for policymaking, evidence-based policymaking in cities. And this huge collective effort helped bring forward more peer-reviewed literature, started bringing together different people from different sectors, like we have on this call together, with different expertise and kind of political drive. And that really fomented what we're now seeing, which is the kind of the epitome of the recognition of the importance of cities on the topic in being a special report on cities for this next AR cycle. So it's a very exciting time, but a very early one at the nexus of national governments recognizing formally the importance of cities, academia recognizing that this does need to be a concerted effort and kind of practice of scientific rigor and excellence, and the NGO community continuing to evolve and think differently and outside the box. So that's a little bit of kind of where we've been, some of the issues, how we got here. But I also think I just finished, I think, on how exciting it is to have this kind of science fiction twist, because in the middle of all of this, and anytime you're doing something for the first time, you're going to butt up against barriers, and this isn't, I don't understand, this isn't this way it looks, and this isn't how it works. And anything that allows us to step outside of ourselves and have a viewpoint of the system at large is phenomenal. And that's what science fiction can do. Science conviction can offer a safe, perhaps, narrative or viewpoint of what is happening outside of our own systems that make us think a little bit differently about it. And that's incredibly important right now. So very excited to hear about the other people's thoughts and reflections on this.
I'm sure our editors at Comms and Daniel Levenbecker himself is going to tell us, yes, it's science fiction, but also science, fiction, depending on what he writes. And the question, what is cities? I think also is one that I'm sure Michelle Udine and Daniel Levenbecker are going to expand our concept of when they read. And we're going to return to this question of what were the arguments that helped integrate, how they were presented, make some of that political progress and knowledge-based process in the discussion section. But Aro, I wonder if we can turn to you. You, like Seth, have a deep history in the intersection of cities and climate change in the international and intergovernmental space. You were a coordinating lead author on Chapter 5, which is the chapter on urban areas in AR5. You then were a coordinating lead author on Working Group 2 in AR6, and a CLA, coordinating lead author on the synthesis bit for AR6 as well, the synthesis report, which was a pretty big undertaking. It all is, actually. And that's just not even to begin to describe your work on everything from water to climate finance to cities. And you are, of course, the executive director and founding director of the Great Indian Institute for Human Settlements. You think, Aro, I've learned a great deal from you, actually, with regards to how one takes, say, 80,000 pages of material and turns it into 8 bullet points. And both are legitimate forms of knowledge and presentation of ideas. When you look at this massive assessment of global science that the IPCC puts together, how do you think about how to turn this into a story that's accessible and usable for policymakers? Something that I know you're not necessarily burdened with when you're doing the reports themselves, but when you're out talking to press, when you're lecturing, that's a little bit of a different exercise, of course, and I know you do both.
So, Ian, I mean, I think the important thing, and Seth yourself and I have done this in the summary of Urban Policymakers, which was a major sort of innovation in the IPCC cycle, and the last IPCC cycle, which lasts 7 years. And that is to take, a tremendous amount of science and evidence and negotiated kind of language and make it accessible, not only to policymakers and people in finance, but people who are actually doing things. And that is, people in cities, whether it's mayors or people in city governments, citizens, small businesses, etc. So, before we started this exercise in the 1.5 report, which Seth and I were on, and it came from Chapter 4, which basically looked at the solution space. So I guess the question before us when we started the 1.5 report was whether 1.5 was possible or not. And this comes from the complications of the negotiations, right? So when we negotiated Paris, there was no clarity about whether there was a real guardrail at 1.5 or not. In fact, in a sense, because of the pressure of the small islands and other countries, effectively the negotiators, which is all the countries in the world, 193 countries, outsource the process of figuring out whether there are solutions that can get us from 1.1, where we are just now, to 1.5. So in a sense, the science community had to scramble because we did not have any evidence there to lay out, first of all, what the problem was and how we can get from here to there, but also the solution space. And I think that was the interesting kind of shift in narrative that took place, where we're going from 3 cycles ago. Let's say if I go back 20 years or more into the 4th assessment cycle of the IPCC, IPCC works in cycles of 7. It's one of those odd kind of places. There was no narrative either around cities or the linkage between climate and cities. There was nothing. It was only in AR5, which was in the early 2000s, that we were able to construct a narrative. And David and I kind of led the chapter on the adaptation side. Karen Seto led the one on the co-led the one on the mitigation side, to try and really put together what Seth was talking about just now, and that is, what's the linkage between cities and climate change, and how does climate change affect cities? Before that, it was nowhere in the narrative. And I think, first of all, trying to make the point that cities are important was a tough job, and then selling that to 193 countries. But there were other things that were happening at the same time. Roughly around the same time, we were also trying to rebuild in the intergovernmental space the value of cities. So, before that, starting from the 70s onwards, cities were meant to be the places where things were messy, mucky. We had crime, you had poverty, you had all kinds of other stuff that's there. The shift that took place between 2013 and 15 in the narrative was cities as places of opportunity for economic development, for culture, for actually producing the new life, and especially so in the emerging world, in Asia and Africa, etc., where, in a sense, the largest urbanizations would take place. So that shift took about 2.5, 3 years to be able to put together. That shift also happened roughly around the same time that we are saying cities are absolutely important as solution spaces to address the question of climate, which then, in the 1.5 report, we showed very concretely was a pivotal, what we call, transition. There are 5 transitions that will enable us to potentially get to 1.5 or hopefully get to below 2 degrees. And one of them is the urban and the infrastructure transition, right? So we constructed this narrative, which is about solutions and opportunities, where you can get from a pretty difficult situation that we are just now, through potentially a very dire situation, which is a 1.5 overshoot or 2 degree overshoot, into a world that could actually be quite different. And this is where I think the connection between science-based narratives and science-fiction or science-fiction narratives come from. It's about the question of what the imaginaries are, because even from the climate science perspective, what's going to happen in 2050, or certainly what's going to happen in 2100, in terms of population, in terms of quality of life, in terms of where the world economy is going to be, what culture is all a matter of conjecture. So a lot of it is sitting in these kind of very large computer-driven models, and now we'll have AI. But I think the real issue there is, what kind of worlds and what kind of worldviews do we expect to see to play themselves out over the century? And in a sense, the models that drive these processes are artifacts of these forms of imagination. And even though the climate scientists don't like to talk about it, I would imagine we are both subtly and more functionally impacted by these imaginaries. So I think there's a really important place for the imaginaries. And the question, of course, is the question of traverse. How do you problematize where you are just now, which is what literature and art and music and all the creative community does. But how and what kind of a future would you want to be living in, and what does it make for us to get us there? And I think that's where the science and increasingly the social sciences and I guess we are getting a fair amount of humanities work happening in the climate space, from archaeology to history to geography and other sciences. So that's a big shift that we've seen, and the coming together to a whole range of different communities, and hence discourses coming together from experiences from across the world. Because in many ways, people who we don't recognize as being important actually hold the keys to our future. Indigenous communities across the world, people in Australia, in the Northern Territories, in Canada, etc. they have learned over 10,000 years or more, sometimes 50,000 years, how to cope with with a dramatically changing climate. Because the Holocene is over, we're in the Anthropocene. We potentially can never go back to the Holocene. So we have to imagine a new culture, a new economy, a new relationship between people and nature and people and themselves. And I think this is really the challenge that we have, that that the arts certainly will be faced with, and how creative we are will actually, in a sense, reconstruct and help us build a new future.
It's fascinating, Aro. And one of the things that I've always admired that you do, and I never saw it clearly yet. I mean, that narrative shift to the solution space is important, but also, at 1.52 parts of the global north or the west think it doesn't apply to them, and you're always reminding them, well, if we hit 2.5 or 3, this applies to everybody. And one of the things that narratives do is they can bring into a difficult situation those who felt they were excluded because of privilege, or bring in and empower those who've been excluded previously as actors in the solution space. I think it's a crucial point. Emily, for those of you who don't know, the Carnegie Endowment, and we are a collection of this call is a collection of people from different disciplines, and so I hope there are people who don't know, has a select group of young scholars who join us every year near the beginnings of their career. And Emily's been doing brilliant work in the climate program and with Carnegie California. And we asked her really quickly to take a review of some of the dominant narratives in the climate space over the last decade or two. We did not actually capture cities as solutions, so that will be integrated from AR5 to AR6 and now 7 per Aro's guidance. But Emily, please just talk to us for a couple of minutes on how you've seen narrative operating in the bigger picture across climate over the last 2 decades.
Thanks so much, Ian. So at Carnegie, we've recently undertaken an ambitious inquiry into predominant climate narratives because we believe it's not enough to simply study climate change. We also need to study the ways in which we talk about climate change, because when confronted with a particular policy issue, the narrative being used by a particular individual or institution shapes the appropriate policy response. Narrative tends to be a rather abstract construct. So to change a narrative, it first requires an understanding of the existing landscape. Narratives are slippery, which is why our project has operationalized narrative in 3 key ways: the story, its features, and the outcome or policies that a narrative prescribes. Our proposed narratives are not exhaustive. They are just some of the dominant tools we use to describe how climate change interacts with social policy. At Carnegie, our work has identified 6 narratives: securitization, opportunism, delayism, environmental justice, technological saviorism, and urgency. So briefly, I'm going to explore each one of these. The first narrative that we've identified is that of securitization, and the story here is that climate change is a national security threat. It tends to be advanced by the State Department or the Department of Defense and features language that is relevant to a U.S. military conflict or context. The outcome of this narrative could include efforts to secure a critical mineral supply chain through friendshoring. Another narrative that we have identified is that of opportunism, and this philosophy is advanced both by government and industry. The idea here is that the energy transition has created emerging sectors that provide job opportunities and enable green growth. This narrative tends to be optimistic and future-oriented, and the outcomes or the policies of this belief could include IRA subsidies or the potential development and expansion by the commercial sector into new markets, such as the alternative protein space. The third narrative that we've investigated is that of delayism, and it also appears in government and industry. We understand delayism to be a neo-manifestation of denialism because few institutions continue to deny climate change outright. This school of thought recognizes that climate change exists, yet it does not result in current behavior changes. So a delayism narrative tends to feature non-committal language or simply failing to live up to prior commitments. these narratives, or this narrative in particular, is not always made explicit. And in practice, delayism could look like project approval that seems contradictory to a stated administration's objectives. Or it could look like a lack of action on behalf of big agriculture for methane reductions, despite understanding its contribution to the climate problem. Our fourth narrative is environmental justice, and this is advanced by advocacy groups and civil society. The narrative here is that given the West developed at the expense of other states through resource extraction and emissions, they have a moral obligation to remedy the inequity. And this narrative tends to feature accessible content, is historically focused, and operates with longer term horizons. At the international level, this has produced the common but differentiated responsibility principle and contributed to the popularity and the use of the loss and damages fund. The fifth narrative that we've investigated is that of technological saviorism, and we see it cropping up most prominently in the industry space. The notion here is that technology has solved every historical problem, and that climate change will be no exception. This narrative tends to be future-oriented, hyperbolic, and untested, and it could manifest in the commercialization of solar geoengineering or widespread carbon capture. And the last narrative that we've really been looking at is that of urgency, which we identify as originating in the scientific community, which believes it has a responsibility to inform the conversation. This narrative promotes the exclusive presentation of facts and data while maintaining objectivity. However, it does include often inaccessible language. The outcome of an urgency narrative is the production of the AR6 report, and it conveys urgency operating kind of as a counter narrative to that of delayism. So while these 6 narratives are not exhaustive, they add value to the climate conversation because they are a snapshot of the ideologies and interest groups operating in the climate ecosystem. To drive just change, we need to recognize the different desires of actors across the system and use narratives strategically to bridge divisions and form coalitions. So as the group moves forward with the AR7 report, they must be intentional in their recommendations and recognize how their prescriptions feed into and contribute to existing narratives. So thank you so much, Ian.
Brilliant, Emily. Thank you so much. And I think also we're going to have to see what we will have to add to those narratives once we hear from Daniel and Michelle now. The Oulipo is a literary collective in Paris, and they do fascinating work on many issues, including experimental work on how to represent urban spaces and integrate them into the processes of writing. And Daniel Levenbecker, who's the author of a book on that collective and a brilliant book on hip hop, actually, is taught me, and I think Seth as well, something really fundamental. After we've been working on cities for a decade, if not more, we turned to the book Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino, which I bet many of our people who are joining us have read. And Daniel summarized a pretty simple point, which is that one of the things it captures is that great tension, that all cities or urban areas are somewhat the same, and yet they're all also very different. And that truth can coexist. It can be a paradox. So Daniel, please tell us a little bit about how you in particular, obviously, have been integrating cities and urban areas into your fiction processes.
Yeah, thanks, Ian, and hello. Really delighted to be here in such august company. I'll start with just a quick introduction, sort of overview of the Oulipo, which is a French acronym for Ouvroir de Littérature Potentielle, which means Workshop for Potential Literature. It was founded in 1960 by Raymond Queneau, who's a writer and publisher, and François Le Lyonnais, who's a chemical engineer and a polymath. Both of these guys were really passionate about both art and science and tons of other things. And the group was initially conceived with 8 other dudes as a seminar about the history of experimental literature, but it soon evolved into a workshop, as the name suggests, exploring what you can call the generative literary potential of structures and systems that we don't conventionally think of as literary. So For instance, on the literary side of the spectrum, we have poetic forms like the sonnet or the haiku or the sestina, which is a 12th century form invented by a troubadour that we work a lot with to sort of poke and prod at the shapes and structures and how it can be generative to play with these rules. Or we do a lot of work with more sort of simple but arduous constraints. A really famous example is a 300-page detective novel by George Perec that doesn't contain the letter E. Or more sophisticated experiments like a novel whose narrative engine is a graph theory problem or a tool for semiotic analysis, as some of Calvino's other works in his late career are. So today there are 41 of us. We're based in Paris. The 41 includes the members who are no longer with us because according to our bylaws, nobody is allowed to quit the ULIPO unless they commit suicide with the express intention of leaving the ULIPO and do so in the presence of a notary. But so we have 41 members living and dead from multiple nationalities, multiple languages, but our working language is French. So the idea behind all of this, as I like to think of it, is to give writers these kind of open source tools to get around creative blocks by essentially outsmarting themselves and focusing on solving problems like you would solve a math problem or solve a puzzle instead of writing beautiful literature. And the stimuli can come from absolutely anywhere. That's part of the point. But as it happens really often throughout the group's history, that stimulus has been the city, because cities are structures, cities are massive collections of sort of interlocking systems, and they're built environments that are naturally full of language and history and forms and micro and macro narratives. So one famous example that Ian and I wrote about a few years ago is Georges Perec's experiment. It's called An Attempt to Exhaust a Place in Paris, for which he just sort of parked himself on the Place Saint-Sulpice in Paris for a weekend and wrote down everything he saw happening, like what color cars drove by, what buses drove by, mothers with strollers, children with balloons, trying to be as neutral and uninflected as possible and just give a record of, as he said, what happens when nothing is happening. Another example is Raymond Queneau wrote a lot of poems about Paris, which are full of landmarks, but also about workers and perpetual construction. Jacques Roubaud has also written a lot of pedestrian poems, wandering through Paris, thinking about whom streets are named after, thinking about Queneau's poems. More recently, Michel Audin, who we'll hear from in a second, led a project in 2017 of texts that sort of interrogate the relationship between Paris and math. Anything from streets named after mathematicians to walking itineraries that are mathematically relevant. And also more locally, her latest book is a collection of short historical fictions that are all rooted on the Boulevard Voltaire. And then the second part of the book is one poem for every walkable bridge in the city. And there's also a really rich vein of Oulipian work that deals specifically with public transportation, which, as I was preparing for this session, sort of took stock of just how much there is. There are a lot of poems about bus lines and subway lines. There are poems made from anagrams of the names of subway stations. There are poems that are actually composed on public transit, most spectacularly a form invented by Jacques Jouet called the Metro poem, in which you write a poem that contains as many lines as your trip contains stops. And if you switch from one metro line to another, then you start a new stanza, and you're not allowed to write while the train is moving. You're only allowed to compose in your head, and you're not allowed to edit or compose while the train is stopped. You're just transcribing what you've come up with between the last two stations, the last station and the present one. So that's a quick overview. There's obviously a whole lot more to say, but Ian, I think, knew at least some of this when he reached out to me in 2019 to invite the Oulipo to do something at a World Urban Forum in 2020. And that fell through for reasons that are now obvious historical reasons, but it got us thinking about particularly another important Oulipian work, which, as Ian already said, is Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities, which is this really monumental work of sort of speculative fiction and philosophy and psychogeography and travelogue. It was published in 1972. And unlike most of the examples I've given, which treat the city kind of as a toolbox, Calvino really treats the city as an abstraction. And so Invisible Cities is organized as 55 vignettes about cities, kind of impossible, invisible cities that are much more thought experiments than anything else. And he gets at something essential, or these different essential things about the cities, by almost systematically stripping away from each imagined city something that we take for granted, some element of urban life that we just assume is part of the city, like gravity, or the fact that the layout of the city is static, or the fact that we bury our dead. Any of these things that he might strip away and kind of think through the manifestation of what a city would be like organized around that one difference. And as you said, Ian, the heart of this is sort of meditating on the way that all cities are the same and all cities are utterly unique and sort of irreconcilably unique. And he dramatizes this with a really smart framing narrative in which it's Marco Polo talking to Kublai Khan about Khan's empire. Khan has sent Marco Polo out to sort of explore the farthest reaches of his empire and travels and what he's seen. And the book kind of switches between this conversation between Polo and Khan and these city vignettes, and becomes more and more philosophical, more self-reflexive. And at one point, Polo says explicitly, yes, all of these cities I've been telling you about are Venice, and all of them are really the city that I've gone to see. So that brings us finally to the project that Michelle and I are presenting today, which will be coming out as a book in French in fall with editions to follow in other languages. It's called Indivisible Cities. And we worked with Ian and Seth and a few different teams of urbanists and climate scientists and architects and policy people to take the 11 categories of city into which Calvino's 55 vignettes are arranged and update them, which is to say, make them a little more conscious of the things that face the global city 50 years later and beyond. So Calvino's categories were things like cities and the dead, cities and the sky, cities and desire, cities and naming, cities and names. And so ours are things like cities and water, cities and movement, cities and borders, cities and work, cities and sickness, hostile cities, etc. And so we took these 11 new categories that we arrived at through many conversations, and we added 5 columns, which is something Calvino doesn't do. We took these from the global systems transformations from the SR 1.5 report. There's land use, industry, inclusivity, earth systems, and then there's a 5th kind of wild card column for things that we thought were important but weren't classifiable as one of these other 4. And so the intersection, we have 11 categories times these 5 sort of vertical themes, and the result is 55 themes. So for instance, the intersection of cities and water and industry would be wastewater management. The intersection of cities and water and earth systems, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, is sea level rise. So we have these 55 themes, some of which are still kind of wonky policy, scientific expert stuff, and some of them were already obvious or have become very obvious because, you know, contagion is one of them. But the assumption is that within the next 20 years or so, all of these things will be part of the common vocabulary. Everyone's going to know what urban heat islands are. Everyone's going to know what, working from home is, as everyone already does. So we had these 55 themes, and then we invited members of the ULIPO, about 10 of us participated, to write vignettes in the style of Calvino that, like he did, treat the city as both concrete and abstract. And each of these vignettes focused, as Calvino did, around one of these themes and interrogated what a city would be like in which the sort of central organizing principle of the experience of that urban environment was sea level rise or was undocumented labor, etc. And each author, when they received the assignment of this or that vignette, also got some bibliographic resources, some white papers or some news articles about, ways in which these themes had come to life already or were starting to. And the other thing, and what I'm going to read to you from in a second, is the interchapter narrative is absolutely based on the way Calvino did it. Everything in the book is structurally the same, the way the chapters are arranged and the way the interchapter narrative recurs, but this one is, instead of Marco Polo and Kubla Khan, it's between Amelia Earhart, the aviator, and William Randolph Hearst, the American newspaper baron. And that interchapter narrative is the place where we sort of confront a little more explicitly the slipperiness of the narrative, to borrow a term from Emily, and kind of what the project is. So I'll read just one of these interchapter pieces, which I believe is from the beginning of section 3 out of 9. Hearst asked Earhart once what she had learned about cities. Not about the individual ones she saw in sequence, but about the object called a city, the entity, the breathing abstraction, the byproduct of human restlessness and ingenuity and labor. They are identifiable by many signs from above, she said. The way the terrain becomes dense and brittle, pockmarked with artificial lights and scarred with railroad tracks and auto routes. The flat quadrille of downtown streets and the Medusa sprawl of cloverleaf interchanges. But once you touch down, they become slippery, almost treacherous, for every turn leads you into the memory of another city, another airfield, another piazza, another parklet. It is an arresting assemblage, by turns magnificent and grotesque, of shining surfaces and depleted materials and extravagant waste, of things seen and imagined and realized and frustrated by time and hubris. And it is easy to forget which city it is you are in, or what makes it a city at all, if not this resemblance to all other cities. And then, taking flight again, you are left with the needling thought of the world as a skein of yarn, a web wrapped around itself so intricately, so ornately, that you might almost forget that there is nothing at the center. Nothing? Hearst said. How can that be? There are people in cities, and with people, without fail, there is a buzzing cloud of meanings, ideas, stimuli, and sensation and spectacle. Endless possibilities for experience and exchange and betrayal. Stories of greater import than the mere local. And not even the mere local can be said, surely, to be nothing. Cities are indeed where these things converge in the most immediate way, she said, where we can go to quench our insatiable thirst for the next thing, the next permutation of sights and sounds and situations. But the thread that connects them, the internal logic, the master story of the city, is different for every soul in it, every person, every beast, every tree. That is what I mean about its lack of center. We respond to how the city answers the questions that are ours alone, irreducibly ours. That is why it can be recognized but not defined. But it is my business to know the questions as well as the definitions, to read the buzz of meanings and disseminate it back to the people who cannot see it because they live inside of it, to help them orient themselves in their reality from somewhere higher up. So what is beyond the city? What is higher? I suspect, she said, it is important to ask and unwise to know. Perhaps the city is the richest stimulus a human civilization can experience without coming undone. Perhaps it is a tenuous equilibrium of our greed for all of those things, for exchange and serendipity and cruelty and love, and the saturation itself is all that keeps us grounded. She paused. And perhaps we aren't meant to be able to travel so quickly from one city to the next, to live in more than one between sunsets. The world is finite, William, a thing that could be encircled, embraced. But its cities know only departures, not returns. The one you leave will have ceased to exist by the time you land. Thanks. And I'll turn it over to Michelle, who will read us some other vignettes.
Hello. Okay, I shall read you 2 vignettes. The first one is about in the category cities and borders. The traveler has come to the city of Faina during the solstice, as have other visitors from markedly different cities. The inhabitants of Faina await them in order to accompany them through the various parts of the city, leading them through the tangled streets of the old town, pointing out the canals and the bridges, the squares, houses, factories, theaters, neighborhood stores and schools, offering them fragrant dishes and fruits, exotic to the newly arrived planet. They then usher them to this planet, where they discover the spider's web of toad strings and pegs that weave a scale model of all Faina's sister cities. Here, each visitor takes pleasure in recognizing and indicating her own city. And already, night has fallen. Everyone gathers and settles in the grand market on kit bags and barrels. Those who come from Faina tell how the city joined with the surrounding towns to form the greater Faina. The older ones recall that the very first city to join Faina at the very beginning of the spider's web was Riga, how they had to get to know one another to avoid another war. Some of the visitors recount how they were welcomed by shelters of families in the cities where they sought refuge. Theirs is the story of the way they were taught their new city, how to speak there, how to work and live there, how to love there as one, how to write poems there, says another, how to make chicken yassa as a young man, and fragrant rice dumplings, and steamed ravioli. The offerings are endless. Tonight in Faina, not everyone speaks the same language, and so we discuss and translate, laughing because we understand or do not understand. In the following days, the visitors continue to learn from each other. The gestures that ward off contagion, the forest that nourishes and protects, even for the poets, the odor of the elephants after the rain. When the nights begin to grow shorter, they return home. At the next solstice, it is a city in the other hemisphere, Osita, Heliwalda, or another, that will organize in its turn the school of the network, where the inhabitants of Faina will go. And now I read you the second vignette, which is about an organic city. It was by sea that the traveler arrived in Chaika. At first, she saw nothing. Beyond the coming and going of the fishing boats, beyond the belt of reefs between which the channel tacks, nothing but the forest. Thousands of calls from thousands of birds soon obscured the noise of the engine as the boat skirted trees that seemed to grow out of the icelands formed by their roots. A house on high stilts, a bridge spanning a canal, a wooden footbridge across which an old man pulled a cart piled high with baskets of sea urchins. This was how the city of Chaika revealed itself, little by little, to the traveler's gaze. The city abuzz in its squares and its streets, its schools and factories, its gardens and yellow dust, its arcades offering shelter from the rain. In Chaika, in the evenings, after work, the young and the old take their places on cafe terraces and invite travelers from other countries and other times to tell their terrifying stories of murderous wars whose bombs killed hundreds of thousands at a stroke, of vast tropical forests set ablaze in malice, of entire farms besieged by packs of wolves, of diseases trailing unthinkable death tolls, of heaps of garbage in gargantuan dumps, of sea monsters sinking ships, of hurricanes of unprecedented gargantuan dumps, of man-eating tigers, of immense waves sweeping away fields of shrimp before drowning the cities that lives in their cultivation, of cruel vampires with bloody lips. They shudder, then smile at each other, miming one last shudder. A glass of rum is poured, and all drink in silence as little bats circle in the evening air. The traveler collected some of these stories in a notebook and resumed her journey, resuming her course towards the sea, which is to say toward the mangrove, the forest that watches over Chaika, absorbing the swell and the waves. Just as Chaika cannot be seen from the sea, the traveler noted, so the sea cannot be seen from Chaika. The mangrove is the horizon of Chaika as well. That's it.
To talk about 1.5 projections or nature-based solutions, Michelle, but I just want to talk about this moment where there was a pregnant pause, and I wonder what the next word was going to be, and it was a tiger, and that makes me very happy on a Tuesday morning doing policy work. Thank you both for those incredible interventions. Aro mentioned the importance of imagination for us all, but I think that all imaginations aren't created equal or exercised equally. And I don't, I wouldn't want to be Liliana or Noah who have to load those readings as well. But Noah, you co-lead the climate program at Carnegie. Liliana, you're a non-resident scholar who's recently joined Focus on Migration. And we're so honored and pleased that you're part of the team. Please, Liliana, and then Noah, reflections on this intersection of creativity, fiction, science, fiction, and and climate and migration, of course. And then I think if there's time, you guys can also open the questions up to the group for any follow-ons. Thanks, everyone. Really, really wonderful to be here with you this morning.
Thank you, Ian. I'm quite happy to be part of this discussion. I've always been interested in the way that advocates think and communicate about an issue. Narratives surrounding migration policy actually play a crucial role because it shapes public perception by framing how people perceive migrants and their impact on society. It influences political decision. It addresses societal challenges. It counters misinformation and builds global cooperation. Regarding the discussion that brings us here today, I'd like to briefly highlight a few points. First, as I said, how we perceive and speak about migrants and migration matters. And in fact, it plays a fundamental role in guaranteeing equality and the human rights of migrants. We must then be mindful about the tension that exists between a narrative that communicates urgency and calls for greater action on reducing emissions or climate action in general by painting an apocalyptic images of floods, threats, masses, waves of cross-border migration, and the narrative we actually need in order to guarantee the human rights of migrants. Last year, for example, I recall that a high-level official at the UN Security Council stated that the world will witness a mass exodus of entire populations on a biblical scale due to sea level rise. As well-intended as they may be, these alarming and doom narratives regarding climate-driven mobility can have actual harmful consequences. They can lead to the securitization of the climate migration discourse, which could be easily picked up by anti-migration populist groups, resulting in more restrictive immigration policies, border securitization, etc. Second, another tension that we need to bear in mind is how we reconcile the need for a nuanced response to climate mobility while maintaining a compelling and concise narrative. In fact, probably most comps especially would say that they probably are opposite concepts. But we need to be cognizant of the fact that the effects of climate change shape human mobility and immobility dynamics in many and very completely different ways. And as such, there are a range of responses and different types that are needed to address the challenges they present. Therefore, we cannot hope for a one-size-fits-all approach. And on the contrary, it's likely that a broad toolkit with different strategies and approaches, depending on the region and the climate change impacts, will be needed. Third, some of the current narratives, in order to be compelling, can fall into the trap of portraying people in communities most impacted by climate change with little agency, in need of protection, as security threats, or dehumanized by large numbers, and in many instances, assuming that they are moving from the global south to the global north. This framing fails to recognize the existence of different flow patterns that research shows will be the most predominant on climate mobility. That is, that the majority of the people is likely to move within their own countries, and where they do move across borders, they will likely remain within their own regions. This narrative also fails to take into account that in many instances, climate change will make migration less accessible, leading to trapped populations in places of risk. And finally, this narrative fails to include an important consideration of this issue, which is the fact that most people don't want to move, and efforts should be made to respect and protect their right to stay. Finally, while climate change affects us all, it does not affect us all equally. So narratives must recognize that those impacted are usually who are not only the least responsible for the problem, but also within affected states, some communities face greater challenges than others. Vulnerable groups such as indigenous communities, Afro-descendant, and other ethnic minorities experience climate change impacts in a disproportionate manner. As Seth mentioned earlier today, the current state-centered system does not necessarily allow to properly respond to these new challenges, and thus the role of city needs to be continued to be underscored. Often the concerns of affected communities are not at the center of the multilateral discussion, and this is particularly true for migrants. There's a need to connect communities across different regions affected by similar climate change impacts so that they can learn from each other, have a common voice, form links rooted in mutual understanding and recognition of the similarities rather than differences. For all of this, I think this conversation today is so valuable. We need to think outside the box. We need to have to stop working in silence and start developing joint narratives using the arts in all its forms to communicate and enhance solidarity and empathy while reimagining our collective future. I think I leave it at there because of time.
Yeah, thanks, Liliana. There's so much to respond to before we have time for just one audience question. When Daniel and Michelle were talking about the restraints that Aleppo authors subject themselves to, like writing a detective novel without the most common letter in the language, it got me thinking about how we might impose restraints on ourselves to inform policy research. Like, what if there were no carbon removal or no borders and no international migration, sort of using the power of imagination there. And another thing I was thinking about, we heard from Seth about how narrative has shifted the focus of science, getting the IPCC to focus research on cities, from Emily about how narrative shifts policy, and from Aro about how narrative shifts, how narrative helps make science accessible to policymakers. And it's also worth thinking about causality going in another direction about how science shifts narratives. The IPCC has done this in the past, until that IPCC 1.5 degree report came out in 2018, the lodestar was meant for many people was an 80% reduction in emissions by 2050. So many groups like heavy industry thought that they could be part of the remaining 20%. So they didn't need fundamental change. But now that we've shifted to net zero and most countries have a net zero goal, if you're making steel, you no longer think you can just make your blast furnace more efficient. You actually need a shaft furnace and green hydrogen and to do direct reduction in order to cut emissions to basically zero. And I think now we're probably at the start of another narrative shift from net zero to net negative. We see countries actually moving the goalpost further. Denmark wants to cut emissions 110% by 2050. They launched a group of negative emitters at COP28 that includes Finland and Panama. Germany's doing it too. And then you have companies like Microsoft who say they're going to, by 2050, remove all the emissions they've ever put into the atmosphere. So really turning back the clock. And that's, again, shifting the goalpost to be more ambitious. And, Ara was talking about the 1.5 report. Since it's now very unlikely that we keep emissions to 1.5 without overshoot, it's sort of people agree that we will need carbon removal as a supplement to massive emissions reductions. But so many things to respond to. I'll stop there because we have one audience question actually coming from Riga, where this AR7 scoping meeting is taking place, from Konstantin, who asks Seth and Aramar, how does this work at municipal level of politician turnover? I'm a member of the Riga City Council, and in my opinion, this topic is completely hidden. Basically asking how do we keep cities involved in climate policy making when these cities can shift between parties and political change happens there?
Fantastic. Well, I know we're close to time, so I'll be very brief, but fantastic that somebody from Riga City Council is here. I'll be in Riga, and hopefully we'll get a chance to meet on this topic. Thank you for joining us today. It's a great question, but there's lots of things that are happening now around the world. We can connect and follow up afterwards, but I'll give you like two quick examples. So one is the policy that you're building into the city that can kind of expand multiple election cycles and how you embed those. One of the interesting things very close to where you're at in Riga is the city of Oslo. And one of the big innovations that the city of Oslo has done is that they've taken the carbon budgeting that usually sits either in the mayor's office or in the office of sustainability, and they placed the authority of that in the office of budget. the first city in the world to do it. So it doesn't matter who they've codified that in the city municipality. So it doesn't matter again what mayor or who is there every year in order to get the different allocations of budgets for the city. It goes to get approved by the Department of Budget and Finance. They look at whether you've met your emission reductions targets or not and allocate your budget accordingly. So it's built into the financial annual budgeting process. There's another bunch of things also happening. It's not just kind of the city can do the best thing possible in terms of like recycling, but if the citizens don't actually recycle, you can't do it. So there's a growing amount of policy around behavior change and education. How do you so if this policy didn't work, do we scrap it and do another policy? Well, actually, the policy only had like a 30% infiltration into usability for the citizens, which it's all about. So instead, let's do a behavior change and education thing and raise that 30% on that policy up to 50 or 60%, and you make a difference. And again, those things all can eclipse and supersede or outlast changes in municipal government elections. But lots more there we can share afterwards.
Just to close on that, Noah, I think the really big shift that's happened in the last 6-7 years since Paris is the narrative has shifted from this is something that can actually be changed by the heads of state and government of about 30-40 fossil fuel exporting countries and maybe 100 CEOs of large coal, oil, and gas companies to the citizens, especially young people, local governments, a whole range of local enterprises across the world. Because the leadership, in some senses, not only of mitigation but absolutely of adaptation, has shifted into the hands of hyperlocal actors. And that shift, I think, is a fundamental shift of imagination. It's almost sort of, an Apollo moment where you're seeing the Earth as one. And people are finding that they actually have the agency to make that change and shift. And that's why I think the urgency is catching them across the world, across major movements. So I think that is a big shift in narrative. And as, the more that we can tell this story in local languages and local cultures and local idioms, the more powerful, I think, the counter movement to deal with the question of climate is. Because climate is about a world in which development, the economy, etc., is fundamentally broken. And that's what we have to fix. Climate change is just a symptom. It's not the cause of the disease.
That's really well said, Armar. Seth, 30 seconds before we conclude here.
Yeah, and just on that, just to encapsulate all of this and going back to Riga's question, it is about narrative shifts. And the comment from the counselor was exactly right. It was one of the biggest challenges 20 years ago. But one of the massive narrative shifts that has happened is this concept of where we talk about think globally and act locally. Well, most cities around the world are like, this is not my problem. I'm elected to take care of my citizens in my city, and I don't have a mandate or the authority to go to a COP or an international event or do anything about it, and I can't control what's outside of my city. But the change in narrative of empowering cities, that when we talk about think globally and act locally, that is mayors. And when you look at the totality of what cities are and the narrative shift that Ara was talking about from a problem to a solution, it's actually becoming a hugely empowering thing that mayors want to step into that international discussion and want to take that action themselves because it is the space to make a difference. And that completely changed in the last 15 years.
I want to thank the audience for coming, all the speakers for their contributions to this really unusual, creative, and fascinating event, very interdisciplinary. And before we go, Liliana, I was just going to say a word on some of the narrative, migration, and climate work we're doing at the Carnegie Endowment.
Thank you, Noah. Thank you, everyone, for such an enriching discussion. I recently joined Carnegie Endowment for International Peace to collaborate on a year-long project examining emerging questions and narratives around climate mobility. We will start this journey by providing a broad overview of the role of migration is playing in political conversation and elections around the world. Please keep tuned to that. We're hoping to contribute to this narrative building by devising narratives that are accurate, inclusive, balanced, and grounded in evidence so that policymakers can challenge misconceptions and promote a more nuanced understanding of climate mobility, reduce discrimination, and ensure the development of fair and effective migration policies. We invite all of you to join us in this important task. Thank you.
Thanks, Liliana. Thank you all, and see you next time.